The damage was done. Not from the laughter itself, but from what it revealed. She was out of rhythm with the community. She couldn't read the room anymore, couldn't sense the shifts in tone everyone else navigated naturally. Social rhythm had abandoned her. She'd always known how to move through these spaces with confidence. Now she was stumbling like a stranger, a gathering to welcome Sadiq back formally. Seats were arranged by hierarchy. When Zainab arrived, she was offered a seat in the honored section. Visible. Respected. Amaka, arriving shortly after, found herself standing. Not because there were no seats. But no one gestured to them. No one made space. She stood for several minutes, waiting for someone to notice. The gathering began. Sadiq spoke warmly to those seated near him. He made eye contact with Zainab several times, his expression showing respect and trust. He didn't look at Amaka. Eventually, someone brought a stool and placed it at the edge. Not ceremoniously. Just practically. Amaka sat on the peripheral stool, her view partially blocked, her position speaking volumes. No explanation was given. None was needed. During a discussion about resolving a dispute, someone quoted Zainab's words from weeks ago. As Zainab said, words don't disappear just because they were spoken loudly. Others nodded in agreement. Someone added, "That's true. We should remember that." Amaka sat very still, watching the sentence she dismissed become community wisdom. Over the following days, she heard it again. And again. At the market. At the well. Young people saying it to each other. Elders using it to teach lessons. The community had adopted it. Given it weight and authority. Meanwhile, Amaka's bold proclamations evaporated. People forgot them the moment they were spoken, as Zainab's whisper had become louder than Amaka's shout. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Amaka tried to assert herself during a meeting about the new well project. She stood, preparing to make a definitive statement. The well should be placed. Her voice cracked. Mid-sentence, it simply broke, splitting into a rough, uncertain sound. The words that followed came out weak and scratchy. She stopped speaking immediately, her hand moving to her throat in confusion. "Are you well?" someone asked. "Fine. My throat is dry." She sat down, trying to understand what had happened. Her throat didn't hurt. She wasn't sick. Yet her voice had failed her. The meeting continued without her input. Someone else made her point, and it was accepted readily. Amaka remained quiet. Decisions were being made without consulting her. Amaka learned about them after they'd been finalized. The harvest festival date was set without her input. The community work schedule was arranged without her participation. She heard about these decisions in passing, mentioned by people who assumed she already knew. "We decided on Saturday for the festival," Mom Ngozi mentioned. "When was this decided?" "Last week. At the planning meeting." "I didn't know there was a meeting." Mom Ngozi's expression flickered uncomfortably. "It was announced after prayers. Perhaps you'd already left." Perhaps. Or perhaps people had stopped thinking to ensure she was informed. Authority had quietly moved on. Tea hadn't been taken dramatically. It had simply drifted away like smoke. Amaka staged one final dramatic confrontation. She interrupted a quiet gathering with accusations about being excluded, about being disrespected. Her voice was loud. Her gestures were expansive. For the first few minutes, people paused and listened out of habit or courtesy. But then, slowly, they began to leave. Not all at once. Just individually, quietly, people remembering other things they needed to do. Mama Blessing excused herself. Elder Chukwu mentioned an appointment. 2 younger women simply walked away. Within 10 minutes, Amaka found herself alone, still mid-speech. She'd commanded no one. Convinced no one, the audience had simply opted out. She stood there, her hand still raised in emphasis, her mouth still open on a word that had nowhere to land. She was left alone with only her own voice. And even that had begun to sound unfamiliar. Recognition came slowly, painfully, like dawn breaking over a landscape you didn't want to see clearly. Amaka sat alone in her compound late one evening, replaying the past weeks in her mind. She blamed Zainab initially. seen her as the enemy, the problem that needed defeating. But Zainab hadn't been fighting her. That was the realization that landed like a stone in still water. Zainab had never fought back. Never retaliated. Never schemed. She'd simply existed. Calmly. Peacefully. With a restraint that had somehow exposed everything excessive in Amaka's approach. It wasn't Zainab who had defeated her. It was her own inability to recognize limits. Her own refusal to see when enough was enough. Restraint had exposed excess. Silence had revealed the emptiness in her volume. Calm had highlighted the chaos in her constant motion. She understood now. Finally. Completely. But understanding arrived too late. The damage was already done. Sadiq made his position clear without drama. At a community gathering, when asked about his plans, he spoke warmly about integrity, about the value of people who maintain their dignity in difficult circumstances. Sat beside Zainab as he spoke, his body language making clear this was deliberate alignment. I've learned that strength isn't always loud. That wisdom often whispers. That the people worth trusting are the ones who don't need to demand your trust. His eyes moved across the gathered crowd. They passed over Amaka without pausing, without acknowledgement. She wasn't condemned. Wasn't publicly rejected. Wasn't addressed at all. Which was somehow worse. Sadiq continued speaking about community values, about the kind of people who built trust rather than demanded it. Amaka was not mentioned at all. Not once. She had become irrelevant to his narrative. No punishment was announced. No formal consequences were declared. Instead, something quieter happened. Something more permanent. Respect simply refused to return. Amaka noticed it in small, accumulating ways. People greeted her politely but briefly. Conversations didn't deepen. Invitations didn't come. Her opinions were acknowledged with non-committal nods. Then the discussion moved on. She wasn't shunned. Wasn't excluded dramatically. She was simply no longer considered essential. No longer consulted. No longer centered in community decisions. The change was invisible but absolute. Like water that had evaporated. You couldn't point to the exact moment it disappeared, but the absence was undeniable. This was permanent. There would be no restoration ceremony. No apology that would reset everything. No grand gesture that would return her to her previous position. The community had made its judgment quietly. And the judgment was final. Amaka remained in the community. She still attended gatherings, still lived in her compound, still walked the same paths. She was seen, but no longer centered. Present, but no longer essential. She occupied space without commanding it. Spoke without being particularly heard. Moved through days that continued regardless of her presence or absence. At the market, she was one customer among many. At the well, one woman filling her pot among many others. At gatherings, one face in the crowd rather than the face everyone watched. This was her life now. Not banishment. Not dramatic exile. Just presence without influence. Being there without mattering the way she once had. And perhaps that was the cruelest consequence of all. Sitting alone one evening, Amaka admitted something to herself that she'd been avoiding for weeks. Even now, even after everything, she wanted more. She wanted an apology from the community. Wanted recognition of how they'd wronged her. Wanted Sadiq to explain himself. Wanted Zainab to acknowledge her power. She wanted satisfaction. Vindication. Proof that she'd been right all along. The hunger was still there. Unsatisfied. Unsatisfiable. She could trace her entire journey backward and see it clearly now. Every victory that had left her empty. Every win that required another win to feel complete. Every moment of praise that demanded more praise to maintain the feeling. She'd never known when to stop. Never recognized enough as enough. And that hunger, that endless gnawing need for more, had been her enemy all along. Not Zainab. Not the community. Her own insatiable desire. Desire itself was the trap. Zainab's life continued quietly, unchanged by what others might have called victory. She tended her garden, carried water, spoke gently when spoken to, lived with the same calm dignity she'd always carried. She didn't celebrate Amaka's fall, didn't claim triumph, didn't even seem to notice the shift in community dynamics that had elevated her while diminishing her former antagonist, or perhaps she noticed but simply didn't need to perform her awareness. Sadiq visited her compound regularly now, spoke with her about community matters, sought her perspective on decisions that needed making. Their conversations were quiet, respectful, characterized by listening rather than performing. Power, it turned out, had never needed noise. It had never required volume or drama or constant assertion. It existed in the quiet spaces, in restraint, in the ability to remain unchanged by others' chaos. Zainab had never fought for it, she'd simply lived in a way that made people want to trust her. Life in the village returned to normal. The harvest came. The festival happened. Decisions were made, work was done, days followed days in their usual rhythm. Amaka watched from the edge. She saw Zainab's quiet influence, saw Sadiq's respect manifested in public trust, saw the community functioning smoothly without her at its center. The damage stayed, not as visible scars, but as invisible barriers, as distances that couldn't be crossed, as respect that wouldn't return no matter how much she might change her behavior now. The silence stayed too. Not the silence of secrets, but the silence of conclusions already reached, of judgments already made, of communities that had moved on. Amaka remained, still present, still breathing, still standing in the same compound where this had all begun, but permanently altered. And the story ended not with punishment or redemption, but with the simple, unrelenting truth that some people are never satisfied, and that hunger left unchecked becomes the thing that destroys them. Not dramatically, just steadily, quietly, completely, until they're still standing but no longer whole, still speaking but no longer heard, still present but no longer seen. The end came not with thunder but with silence, and that silence would last forever.